So may I say how lovely it is to see everyone tonight. It's really nice. And a big welcome to Ian, Ian Bradley, who's an old friend of Christians Aware. He was with us on Holy Island last year. We had a wonderful time with lectures on God is Green and Celtic theology. Ian is Emeritus Professor at St Andrews University and has written many books in many different academic areas, including green issues, liberation theology, Celtic theology, and of course, music. We mustn't forget music, and that's an important part of your life, isn't it? But also pilgrimage. And tonight, I think we are focusing on pilgrimage. The title is a new one to me, and I'm very much looking forward to listening. The Coffin Roads, Journeys to the West. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. No, lovely to be back here and see a lot of familiar faces from that wonderful time we had together on Lindisfarne, and also to see Brian Woodcock from way back. We can't quite work out whether it was where we last met, but wonderful to see you again, Brian, and obviously to see you, Barbara. Yes, now I'm actually heavily into musicals at the moment as we speak. I'm pursuing the spirituality of Andrew Lloyd Webber, which is very interesting, and I've just been writing about the Lion King and all sorts of things. But anyway, we're not talking about that tonight. No, well, I hope this is about pilgrimage. This is based on one of my recent books called the Coffin Roads, Journeys to the West, which came out last year, or I think 2022 possibly, which is actually the second of a trilogy on aspects of death that I've just finished. The first one was an anthology of readings about death and the afterlife from many different traditions, predominantly Christian, but also Sufi, Muslim, and Hindu. And then I've just most recently done a book on Victorian views of heaven called Breathers of an Ampler Day. But I'm going to talk about the Coffin Roads, which is in a sense, you're right, Barbara, a kind of pilgrimage, but also has a lot of resonances, I think, about the way we approach dying and death and mourning. Now, if any of you have walked or cycled in through the Highlands, the West Highlands, particularly in the islands of Scotland, you may very well, consciously or unconsciously, have been going along old coffin roads because they crisscross the Highlands and the islands. They're not restricted to this part of Scotland or indeed to the United Kingdom, as I'm sure you know, although they often have different names in England and Wales. Coffin roads is particularly used in Scotland. But I focus on the coffin roads of the Highlands and Islands because they are some of the longest coffin roads, and I think also some of the most interesting ones. Several of them are now long distance footpaths, some of them going for as much as 100 miles, and they've been taken over often for ordinary roads, tarmacked and used for ordinary travel, as well as for footpaths and cycle tracks. Now, as their name implies, these coffin roads were basically established and developed so the bodies of the dead could be carried for burial to the remote graveyards that are still such a feature of the West Highlands and the Hebridean landscape. And they tended to be specifically designated for that purpose. So you would not walk on a coffin road unless you were carrying a coffin. They weren't used for ordinary human traffic. And they were, as I say, many of them later adapted for public tracks and rights of way. They had their heyday really in the 18th and 19th centuries, and most of my research and most of what I'll be sharing with you tonight comes from the 19th century, but they go back long before that and largely fell into disuse in the very early part of the 20th century. The place that has still kept many of the traditions that I'll be talking about alive more than anywhere else is the island of Barra in the Western Isles, the very strongly Catholic island of Barra, where the last chapter of my book is set, where many of the practices I'll be talking about went on certainly until the 1960s, and to some extent are still found today. But on the whole, the coffin roads disappeared in the early years of the 20th century. Journeys along them were often long and arduous. Relays of 6 or 8 men, and they were always men, would carry the coffin either on their shoulders or on long spikes, and they would stop at frequent intervals for rest and refreshment. We'll see sometimes rather too much refreshment, and be relieved by another bearer party. The slow progress on foot from the place of death to the place of burial could sometimes last for 2 or 3 days and nights, and involve several hundred bearers and mourners, as we'll see in some cases, walking through wild and desolate country, with their food, drink and bedding being carried by pack horses. One of the striking features about the coffin roads, and you can still see them today, are the cairns that were built along their route. These mark the places where the bearer parties would stop to rest, and in some cases they were actually used as a platform for the coffin to rest while the bearer party was resting. We'll see the reasons why that was particularly important in a moment. And those carrying the coffin would either build a small cairn to commemorate the dead at each resting place, or add stones to an existing cairn. And this was a very important ritual. I mean, now, as you know, if you climb a mountain, you often add a stone to the cairn at the top, but we do it perhaps in a rather casual manner. This was a very careful ritual, which was actually seen as a mark of respect to the dead, and stone, the importance of stone, which I have a lot about in the book as a memory of the dead, is reinforced by that. The coffin roads come in all shapes and sizes. Some were relatively short and simple, connecting a township with a relatively nearby graveyard. Others involved crossing lochs, and quite often crossing the sea, as in the routes that were used by the many who took coffins to Iona, which was of course a very important place of burial right from the Middle Ages onwards, particularly for those who could afford it. And we see the reasons why islands, and particularly islands in the west, are very important in a moment. But there were well-established coffin routes running right across Scotland, and then crossing over either to Mull or directly to Iona. The places at which coffins were landed onto boats were often called in Gaelic Port na Marv, the port of the dead, or Carreg na Marv, the rock of the dead. And in fact, many of you, I think, know Iona, and the bay near where you land now if you go to Iona, which is called Martyrs Bay, and slightly erroneously, I think, and possibly associated with the martyrdom of many of the monks, but actually it was probably originally Port na Marv, or the Bay of the Dead, and it was where the coffins were landed on Iona. There's one very striking characteristic of the coffin roads, and that is that they tend to run from east to west. Now, there are practical reasons for this, and there are also spiritual reasons. On islands like Harris and Egg and Barra on the Western Isles, the soil on the east coast is too rocky and barren to dig a grave there. So although many of the settlements are on the east side of these islands, people, when they died, had to be carried over to the west, where they could be buried in the much softer macha. And so that explains the east-west trajectory there. But there was also a strong sense that you wanted to be buried in the west, the place of the setting sun. And of course, this is by no means peculiar to the Hebridean and Highland people. It goes back to Greek mythology and Homer's Iliad. The land of the dead is seen as being out in the far west beyond the river Oceanus. Celtic mythology shared the ancient Greek idea of the islands of the blessed, heavenly realms lying far out in the Western Seas, described in Gaelic as Tir na Noch, the land of eternal youth, Tir na Biao, the land of the living, Tir Fortune, the land under the waves, or Tir Tengir, the land, the promised land. And Christianity, of course, didn't dispel this pre-Christian notion. You think of the Brendan voyage, where Brendan, of course, and his monks go out into the Atlantic to find the promised land, the land of the saints far out in the west. And as I say, many people wanted to be buried on the islands of the west, not least Iona, but also islands like Colonsay, because they felt you were closer to this heavenly realm, the islands of the blessed out in the Atlantic, as well as closer to the setting sun. There were many superstitions attached to the coffin roads and many stories centered around them. There was a belief that if the coffin touched the ground, the spirit of the deceased might return to haunt the living. And that was why the coffins often rested on these cairns, so that they never actually touched the ground. Coffins were generally carried with the feet of the corpse facing away from home, to avoid again the possibility of the spirit returning to haunt it. And coffin bearers often were very careful not to step off the path, because there was a danger, if it was farmland, that the crops might be blighted. They often take quite circuitous, meandering routes when you look at them on the map. And this was because spirits were known to like to travel in straight lines. So to frustrate them, the coffin roads would take twists and turns, and they would often go over running water, something that spirits were thought unable to do. Coffin roads were often associated with premonitions of death. I have a whole chapter in the book on the premonitions going right up to relatively recent years. For example, premonitions of deaths in the Falklands War, where people would see phantom funeral processions coming down the routes of coffin roads. It's all part, of course, of the Celtic second sight and the very well attested examples of this. And those gifted with second sight would often have these rather frightening visions, often very clear to them who it was who was in the coffin, and then a few weeks later that person would indeed die. There's one very dramatic example which I give in the book of a walker traversing what had previously been a coffin road and experiencing a very graphic vision of a bloody massacre which had taken place there in the 18th century. And people also quite a lot of stories of people being carried along coffin roads when they were still alive. One involves the funeral procession along the Harris coffin road. When the bearers stopped for a rest, they heard a noise coming out of the coffin, and they opened it and found the person was still alive, and they hurriedly carried them back to the East Coast. There are some wonderfully evocative and detailed accounts of funeral processions along the Highland and Hebridean coffin roads, most of them, as I say, dating from the 19th century. And I just share two of them with you now to give a kind of foretaste. There's a lot more in my book, both of which are recalled by Dr. John Mackenzie, who was a doctor and also the factor at Gairloch in the Highlands. And they're two very contrasting funeral processions in which a coffin was carried many miles through the Northwest Highlands in the early 1830s. The first was conducted with what Dr. Mackenzie describes as in the old way, with whiskey flowing like water. The Laird of Dundonald had died in Edinburgh, and his body was taken by sea to Inverness and then by horse and cart to Garve, where the road ended. And Mackenzie says at that spot it was met one evening by the whole of the adult male population of the Dundonald estate. They were to start carrying the corpse early the following morning. There was no place where even a 20th of the crowd could sleep, so they sat up all through the whole of the night, drinking themselves drunk, as there was any amount of drink provided for them. though probably little food. Early in the morning, a start was made by the rough track which led to Dundonald, some 25 miles away. The crowd of semi-drunken men had marched several miles when one of the mourners, who was perhaps more sober than the rest, suddenly recollected that they had no coffin with them, they having left it behind them at Garve, and so back they all had to trudge to fetch their beloved laird. Now, the other procession that Mackenzie writes about couldn't be more different. It was planned with military precision and involved the conveyance of the body of Lady Kythie Mackenzie, who died of in childbirth at the age of 23 in Gairloch, for burial at Bewley Priory, which was more than 70 miles away. And in the absence of any roads suitable for wheeled vehicles, Dr. Mackenzie himself, who was the brother-in-law of the deceased, resolved the coffin should be carried shoulder high by parties of men from the parish. He selected more than 1,000 people volunteered for this task, and he selected 500. It was a task that involved 3 days walking with the coffin to Bewley Priory and then 3 days walking back. He says, I picked out 4 companies of 125 strong men, made them choose 4 captains and explained clearly to them all the arrangements. I was to walk at the coffin foot. We would rest the first night at Kinloch and the next at Conan, say 24 miles the first day and 40 the second. The third day we were to reach Bewley and return to Conan, say 9 miles. He sized the company up to have roughly equal sized men in each troop. He constructed the biers so that the side rails should easily lie on the bearer's shoulders, allowing them to slip in and sleep out. And he had 8 men in each company, and they would work 4 at each side, and then fall out, and another 8 men would step forward and take over. He said, had the men been drilled at the guards' barracks in London, it would have been impossible them to have gone through their willing task more perfectly. Not one word was audible among the company on duty. Every sound was uttered sotto voce. I'm sure every man of them felt highly honoured by the service entrusted to him. All of us being good walkers, we covered about 4 miles an hour. There was plenty of food. The food was carried on creels, on horses, for each halt on the way. We had plenty of straw or hay for beds at night. And he gives a very moving description of, on the second night, some distance east of Achnasheen, we halted to give the men a little rest and some food. And as I spread them out on the sloping grassy braes above the road and saw food handed round by the captains, it was difficult not to think of our Redeemer when he miraculously fed the thousands who came to him in a wilderness, probably not very unlike the bleak Achnasheen moor. Before we moved away again, every man had added a stone to the cairn on the spot where the coffin had rested. And he describes the fact that every man was dressed in their sailor homespun blue clothes, the sort of thing they'd wear for Sunday worship. Not one of them asked for a penny. These were working men who gave up a week of wages, as I say, 3 days walking there and 3 days walking back to carry the coffin on this huge journey. Now, these 2 accounts reflect, I think, the very different ways in which death was approached by Highlanders. For some, it was an occasion for irreverent revelry and drunkenness, both during the wake that followed immediately after someone died and at the funeral. For others, it was a matter of the utmost solemnity. And these 2 responses could coexist together at the same time, as evidenced by many of the accounts of the funerals that I've read and that I talk about in the book. And they point, I think, to the wonderful sort of mixture of reverence and respect and emotion and excess which surrounded death in the Highlands and the Hebrides. The other thing you get from Mackenzie's account, of course, is the huge number of people, all men, who would turn out for these funerals. The women, of course, on the whole, were not involved, although as we'll see, they were hugely involved in the wake, in preparing the body, and indeed in ministering to those who were dying. But when it came to carrying the coffin, it was an all-male activity, but huge numbers of people. It was a very public activity, and it was something that people, of course, remembered for years afterwards, becoming the subject of many stories and legend. One of the reasons, of course, why these journeys were so long was the huge desire of Highlanders and Hebrideans to be buried among their ancestors. Still true today. When I interviewed for the book the current Catholic priest on Barra, he says that not a night goes past, but the Caledonian McBrain steamer into Castle Bay brings, usually now, the cremated remains in an urn of somebody who was born in Barra, or whose ancestry goes back to Barra, but may have lived anywhere in the United Kingdom or beyond, but who has this desire to be buried back in Barra, and some of the family or the extended family or some distant relatives will be there to meet the boat, to take the urn, and then to carry it ultimately to be buried on Barra. And this desire to be buried among one's ancestors in one's ancestral home was hugely strong in the Highlands and Islands. It was part of the Celtic temperament and is written about a lot. And it was reinforced by a widespread literal belief in the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body, when, as you know, all the dead will rise from their graves. So this meant it was very important that the whole body should rest in the graveyard and no parts be left missing. Among the stories about the coffin roads of the Northwest Highlands, were many of them collected by Archibald Robertson, who was a Church of Scotland minister, who was the first person, incidentally, to climb all the Scottish Munros. He has a wonderful story about an unusual journey made in 1894 on the track, the Coffin Road from Glengarry to Glenmoriston. An inhabitant of Glenmoriston had been staying in Invergarry when it had an accident which necessitated the amputation of his leg, and his brother came across and carried the leg right over a high mountain, Cairnamam, and buried it in the old graveyard where he knew they would all one day rest. And Robertson says this shows what store the old Highlanders laid on their being buried as far as possible, whole and intact, so that at the resurrection they would arise perfect and entire. And it's significant, it was a family member, a brother here, who was doing this. In most of the Highland funerals, it was family members who would undertake all aspects of the mourning rituals and the preparation for the funeral. There were no undertakers, of course, in this time, and in fact, ministers of religion were not very involved. They might take a service in the house, but certainly on the Protestant side, they wouldn't be involved at the graveyard. The Catholic priests would possibly be more involved, but on the Protestant side, it was very much something that was almost entirely done by the families. They would undertake all aspects of the mourning rituals, the preparation for the funeral, hosting and providing the refreshments for the wake, organizing and supervising the carrying of the coffin, and digging the grave. The grave was almost always dug by either family members or neighbors or friends. There were no local authority staff, of course, in those days to dig graves. The rituals, the procession along the Coffin Road by which the deceased was taken home symbolized, I think, very much the idea of death as a journey. And it's one of the main factors that I try and bring out in my study of the Coffin Roads, because the passage from this life to the next is seen as a gradual one rather than an instant process, and it's marked by a series of rituals. Death, in fact, was prepared for very well in advance. Young brides, when they got married in the 18th and 19th century Hebrides and Highlands, regarded one of their first duties in marriage as to prepare winding sheets for their own and their husbands' interments. And when someone was clearly approaching death, quite near death, they were visited, tended, and ministered to, not just by the local parish minister, but much more by family and friends, and also, very interestingly, by the group of semi-professional mourning women who were often brought in to sing the death croon over them and so ease their passage into the next world. Some of you will be familiar with these death croons. They appear in Alistair Carmichael's Carmina Gadelica, and also in the works that Kenneth MacLeod, the parish minister on the island of Gir and Canna, collected. They're very, very moving, and they go right back to ancient Celtic traditions of the soul friend, the Anam Cara, singing to his or her soul friend as they die, a chant which leads them into the next world. And they are a very important part of the process of dying, and also of the grieving and mourning process. And I find it very interesting. Some of you may be aware of this. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm giving a talk about the Coffin Roads to a group, Scottish group of celebrants with the rather splendid name of Pushing Up the Daisies, who are trying to get people to think much more about what kind of funerals they would like. There are several groups. There's another group some of you may have encountered called the Soul Midwives, who exist right across the United Kingdom, and I recently talked to one of their groups in Scotland. And all these groups, who are very interestingly largely coming from outside the church, and I think it raises questions about whether we in the church have rather failed when it comes to dealing with the dying and the mourning. These are mostly celebrants, humanist celebrants, or celebrants who are open to all faiths, and they're certainly not in any sense antagonistic to Christianity, who are really getting people to think about what kind of funeral they would like, what would be most meaningful for them, for the relatives. And one of the things that's coming back, very interestingly, certainly in Scotland, is this idea of singing the dying person into the next life. And I find it very interesting. And some of the other rituals that I'm talking about tonight are also very much on the agenda of these groups, like the Soul Midwives, the Pushing Up the Daisies group, and other groups who are trying to get people to open up more about death and give people some kind of choice and some people of involvement in their own funerals and in the funerals of loved ones. So there's this idea, the mourning women, who are also often the midwives, interestingly, in the community. So they, as it were, brought people into life and took them into the next life. And there's fascinating descriptions of them, particularly by Carmichael and Kenneth MacLeod, that I quote. After death, the body was washed, and of course, the vast majority of people, nearly everyone at this time, was dying at home. And even now on Barra, the parish priest was telling me there's a great move, even if people are in care homes or in the little hospital, to actually have them back home to die. But in this time, of course, nearly everyone was dying at home. And after death, their bodies would be washed and dressed and left lying prominently in the front room of the house, often with a plate of salt placed on their breast. Now, there are various theories about the origin of this. Salt was often used in baptism in the Highlands, and is this a kind of return, the idea that you're baptized with salt and then you die and go into the next world with salt? Is it simply as a preservative? The body was usually only kept in the house for 2 nights, at most 3, so it didn't really need a preservative. All sorts of theories. On Barra, the salt, the idea of the dish of salt goes back a long way. We have lots of accounts of it, still happens on Barra. On Barra, the parish priest told me now, and this is a relatively recent phenomenon, he doesn't know where it's come from, as well as the dish of salt, there is often a bent iron nail, rather in the shape of a crucifix, also put in a dish on the breast of the one who's died. So you have these various rituals, and as I say, for 2 days and 2 nights, the body would remain in the house, constantly watched over by a family member, with a wake held in the house to which all friends and neighbors would be invited, which often became rather raucous and exuberant. There are some wonderful descriptions of what could happen in these wake. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the right page. I think it's in the book to describe one of them. Yes, this is a description of the Elizabeth Grant of Rocky Mercus describing the death of George Ross, who was the husband of the Rocky Mercus henwife. In 1812, after a bottle of whiskey, or maybe more, had failed to cure him, he died, and he was given a wake after the old fashion, shaved and partly dressed, and set up in his bed, all the countryside collecting round him. After abundance of refreshment, the company set to dancing, when from the jolting of the floor, out tumbled the corpse into the midst of the reel, and away scampered the guests, screaming and declaring that the old man had come to life again. Now, this is really quite common. There are wonderful descriptions of people sitting with the corpse, often with the corpse propped up, drinking, smoking, playing cards, talking. So there's this, again, this kind of gradual sense that death doesn't just happen suddenly. The dead are to some extent still there, and there's this wonderful kind of matter-of-factness about it, and they're wanting to involve the dead still. And the wake, fascinating descriptions of wakes. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon, which I think helps people, or help people to come to terms with death. So after these 2 days and nights of wakes, really, the grave would have been dug. People would have been got in touch with to come, often for many miles, and again often walking. I have a whole chapter on funerals in the island of Jura and the Coffin roads there, and descriptions of people walking for days to get to a funeral. Well, probably only 2 or 3 days, because that was about the only notice they had. Once the mourners had assembled, the funeral procession would set off along the Coffin Road to the graveyard. And as I've said, in the case of the Presbyterian Protestant Highlands, the minister would probably say prayers in the house over the body, but then would relatively rarely accompany the corpse to the graveyard. There are, I've got some very interesting accounts of funerals where the minister did come on and often slightly inhibited some of the drunkenness afterwards, but this was relatively rare. And after the interment, all those who were present would be very liberally entertained with drink and food, first around the graveside and then later at some local hostelry or specially erected tent, or if the weather allowed it, in the open air. Some of these things persist. I done various locums on the island of Jura, and I remember probably about 15 years or so ago attending the funeral. It wasn't actually taken by me because another minister came over to do it, but of a former session clerk of the church, and we all stood around his open grave at the end, and a bottle of whiskey, or several bottles of whiskey, and oatcakes were handed round, and this was as a kind of survival of this tradition, that you would have a dram and share an oatcake as you were still looking down on the open grave. These rituals, I think, played a key role in easing and facilitating the grieving process. They provided lots of tasks, of course, for people who were mourning, some of them backbreaking, like digging the grave or carrying the coffin, which occupied people and gave them a kind of focus at a time of emotional upset and sorrow. And they punctuated the period following death with familiar, reassuring domestic and community activities, created a kind of threshold, liminal space, which blurred the hard edge between the living and the dead. and gently eased both the deceased and the mourners into their changed state. And they're part, of course, of a much wider landscape of death, which any of you who visited the Highlands and Islands will be aware of, those very dramatic, remote graveyards, which are very distinctive, I think, to that part of the country, and a lot of superstitions attaching to them. It was very unlucky to be the last person buried in a graveyard, because your soul had charge of everyone else there. And if there were 2 funerals on the same day, there would be a great race to be the first with your loved one, your deceased one, into the graveyard, because they wouldn't have this onerous job of looking after all the souls there. And there's some very, very interesting accounts and stories about that. What I think the Coffin Roads speak to us about, I've been writing a lot in all these 3 books about, I think, the fact that we are now coming out of a period which has gone on for the last 120 years or so, where we have largely shunned death and really wanted to push it aside. And I think we're coming out of that period. Some of you were probably involved with the death cafes, which have sprung up all around the country, all around the world. Indeed, there's much more openness now, I think, to death. The medical profession is changing its mind about the benefits of constantly trying to prolong life and intervene at every single point. And I think the kind of things I'm talking about are becoming very relevant again when we look back at a society which I think was much more open about death, regarded it much more as part of the natural course of things, and something which we shouldn't try and push aside and sort of shun and avoid at every point. And it speaks, I think, of an approach which is holistic and open and very healthy. That very different, of course, from our modern thing where people mostly die in hospital side rooms. Their bodies are whisked away by an undertaker and sealed in a coffin and then cremated. This, of course, still doesn't happen very much in the Highlands and Islands. The only crematorium is Inverness, and of course there's no shortage of land there as there is in many other parts of the country. So most people in the Highlands and Islands are still buried, even if they're not carried now miles on a coffin road, although some are still carried to their grave a shorter distance. The traditional Highland and Hebridean way of death, I think, has quite a lot to say to us. As I say, the body's lying at home, so friends and neighbours can visit and say their farewells and indeed share a joke and reminiscence before that final journey, which kind of signifies the journey to the next world. And it's very personal. It's very communal. It involves the whole community and public, and it doesn't have the kind of embarrassed avoidance of the topic that I think we've so much got into now. And I think in the context of our growing openness to death and the afterlife, I think we can revisit some of these beliefs and traditions. There's also, of course, a very close sense of the physicality of death and laying the body in the ground. From dust you come and to dust you will return, and the very song link of the spiritual and the physical, which of course we find in Celtic Christianity and we find in pilgrimage. I mean, when you said, Barbara, that this is in a sense a form of pilgrimage, I would absolutely agree with you. The journeys along the coffin roads were pilgrimages. The journey to death was seen as a pilgrimage, and so it very much reinforces the pilgrim motive, and it's perhaps appropriate now that pilgrims are walking along the former coffin roads. I mean, I don't think in Scotland, where we're developing, as you know, a whole number of pilgrim tracks, I don't think any of the coffin roads have been specifically designated as pilgrim roads, although they have certainly been designated as long distance footpaths. For example, the Stony Molan Road, which links two of the Loch Lomond and the Loch I'm going to forget, which is part of the John Muir Way and part of the Three Lochs Way, and some of the long distance footpaths, the West, not the West Highland Way, but others are going along Coffin roads, but they're not specifically designated as pilgrim ways. But I think they are. They do have something to say to us. I'll finish there, I think, and happily take any questions or points. But thank you very much for listening to me.